to Strong Towns Curbside Chat, Chuck Marohn. I'm Jeff Sherman with Downtown Voices Coalition. We're one of the co-hosts of this event. Downtown Voices Coalition formed in about 2004 as a community group focused on a lot of these issues, and mainly on kind of the open, frank discussions that we need to have in downtown. The one thing I want to promote is we also have one more event coming up in September 26th, 7 p.m. at Burton Park Public Library. We're co-hosting the mayoral debate for the city of Phoenix, so please come out. Also, please vote. A lot of upcoming elections. Please vote. Anyone want to get involved? There are a lot of organizations that help put this event on. I'm going to read them out. There's literature back. Most representatives are here. If you want to get involved and do something, there's people here that will help you do so. This event was kind of co-sponsored by Local First Arizona, Sustainable Communities Collaborative, Urban Phoenix Project, Rail Mesa, ASU Sustainable Cities Network, American Philanthropic, Vitalist, Downtown Phoenix Center. So a lot of great organizations. And I want to bring up our co-host, Terry, to talk about this and introduce them.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think this is the one that's feeding back. There we go. Oh, it might be me. Hopefully not. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Wow. Was that you?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice to be here. It's been a long day. Whenever I travel west, I get the time zone change. That's pretty intense. It is hot here. I realize all of you think it's inclement. It's very nice. It is very nice, I'm sure. It is really hot. It was 58 degrees when I left home this morning, and this temperature here is much warmer than this Minnesotan is used to. It's great to be able to come out a day early and spend some time with you. I am the one feeding back. I will try to, I think if I stay back, yeah, that's kind of a bummer because I'm kind of a close person. But I will stay back as if I have some type of infectious audio disease. We'll keep a safe distance, that's fine. It's nice to be here a day early. Back in 2008, as the country was going through kind of the first rumblings of the housing crisis, we were going through this kind of crazy period of time where all of a sudden gas was $4 a gallon. Our election season, we were having this kind of crazy presidential election. It seemed crazy at the time. Now it seems kind of quaint looking back how simple life used to be. But I remember at the time being incredibly frustrated with the dialogue. I remember being very upset that, of the conversations taking place around this like deep crisis, set of crises that we were having, I felt like none of them really touched on the core issues. So after the election in November of '08, I sat down and I started to write. I said, I'm gonna write 3 days a week because I had all these thoughts in my head, and really, in some ways, it was cheaper than therapy to sit down and write. But I knew I had to figure some things out. The act of writing is one of those things that forces you to kind of more clearly enunciate and explain the random thoughts in your head. And I was really trying to, in a broad way, explain why our cities were struggling. Why, despite the jobs creation incentive programs, despite all the infrastructure we were building, despite all the growth and the development, why were we struggling to just do basic things? In my hometown, we were in the process of doing this huge kind of $9 million shortcut around the south side of town. And just for some context, $9 million is our total budget for the year. So this was a huge project. Yet we were laying off police officers and firefighters. We were closing the library early. We couldn't keep the street lights on overnight because we didn't have the money. How is this possible? And so I started to write. And after a period of time, a couple friends of mine came to me and said, this is really important stuff. You need to start a nonprofit. And I said, well, you see like the things I've got going on? Like I can hardly find time to do this. They said, you just keep writing, we'll fill out the paperwork. And they did. A year later, we had a 501c3. And a few months after that, a foundation contacted me, said, come up and tell us what your nonprofit does. What are your programs? I said, we don't have any programs. It's just me writing a blog. And they said, well, come up and tell us what you want to do. And I gave them the very early rendition of this presentation here tonight that we call the Curbside Chat. I've been able to give this, I think we're well over 300 times now around the country. I've actually never been able to do this in Arizona. It's one of like 3 states that I've not done a Curbside Chat in. So this is really great. It's like a checkbox for us, but there's also like a huge movement of people here that read our stuff and share our stuff. So it's great to be here among you tonight. Just real briefly about our organization. Our mission is to support a model of development that allows America's cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. The thing that we are good at is sharing a message and nudging people to do something with that. And so what you'll find us doing is writing articles. It's not just me now, there's a whole collection of people that are writing. We generally publish 3 articles a day on Strong Towns. We are trying to explain this suburban experiment and the financial ramifications of it in as many ways as we can to as many different audiences as we can. Bring them in a door and have a bigger kind of connected continent-wide conversation. We do a podcast a couple days a week. We do videos frequently, and I'll give you the address to all that stuff at the end. I wanted to here in Phoenix, here in the Southwest, because the Southwest is such a disorienting place for me. The size, the scale, the intensity of everything in the Southwest of the U.S. is so like baffling to me in many ways. And we're going to get into this a little bit, but I wanted to start with this example because I think these very simple numbers from Lafayette, Louisiana tell a powerful story that's going to resonate with you here when you see it. I was invited to be part of a project in Lafayette, Louisiana to help them figure out why they were broke. They had a huge backlog of road maintenance, and the biggest tax increase that they could possibly fathom, they could have quadrupled that amount of money and it still wouldn't have cut into the backlog of road maintenance. One of these very prudent places, they kept taxes down, they kept debt down, they tried to make strategic investments, yet they didn't have any money. Why? And I went there with a team that included Joe Minicozy in his group at Urban 3 out of North Carolina. And we put together a series of maps, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that at the end, but I want to show you some data we pulled from this really great map of their water system that we found. It was a map that was put together in 1949. And so it had all the details of their water system. And what we found is that Between 1949, so basically like the end of World War II, up to the present age, the population of Lafayette has grown 3.5 times. It's quite a significant amount of growth, but very much like this place has grown, far more than that. When we were able to look at the pipes, though, for the city, in order to get that 3.5 times population growth, back in 1949, they had 5 feet of pipe per person in the city. Now, today, it's 10 times that. It's 50 feet of pipe per person. You can think of this as a family of 4. The excess wealth of a family of 4 would need to be able to sustain 200 feet of pipe over the course of a generation. When we look at the hydrants, because they had all the hydrants where they were shown on the map back from 1949, what we see is that the number of hydrants grew by 21 times. So their population grew by 3.5, but in order to get that population growth, it took 10 times and 20 times the amount of essentially input, public investment, in order to make that happen. Now, you could look at these numbers and say, okay, Chuck, the population's more decentralized, it takes more input to do that, but we're way wealthier today than we were back then. So we ask the question, what has happened to family wealth? What has happened to our incomes? What does the family situation look like? And what we see is that while population's grown 3.5 times, our liabilities have grown between 10 and 20 times. The amount of wealth we have has just not kept up. There's a diminishing returns to this approach. And this is going to be like a recurring theme that we look at over and over again tonight. I want you to think about the way we built cities thousands of years ago. If we go back to, the artist rendering here on the left is an ancient city called like 3000, 4000 BC. The one on the right, of course, is ancient Rome. If we look at these, we understand intuitively that they were built around the dominant transportation technology of the day, that, of course, being your 2 feet. People would walk everywhere they went, and so the spacing, the scale, the distance between different types of things you would do on a normal day, all this was based around a society of people who walked. Fast forward thousands of years, this is my hometown. I live in a little town called Brainerd, Minnesota. It's a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul today. This is what it looked like back in 1904, People would arrive here by train, they'd arrive by stagecoach. But once they got to this city, they would walk everywhere they went. So the spacing, the scale, the distances between different things you would do on a normal day, all this was very similar to the style of development that we had seen for thousands and thousands of years. Beginning in the early 1900s and then accelerating after World War II, we of course began to build around a different transportation technology, right? We began to build around the automobile. We came up with different building types, different building styles, different ways of arranging things on the landscape. If you were to go out and ask people today to explain this transition, they would most likely talk about it in terms of progress. We used to walk everywhere we went, so we build cities around people who walked. Now we drive everywhere we go, so we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities around people in jet cars. And someday we will teleport, and our cities will look completely different than they do now. This is a very comforting way to look at this. It's a narrative of progress, and it puts us on this kind of historic continuum of everything getting better. There's another way to look at this, though, that isn't quite as affirming. And I want to put this notion in the back of your brains as kind of like a seed that hopefully will germinate, not just a little bit tonight, but over the coming weeks and months. When we look at these cities and we ponder them, we have to acknowledge that even by the time you get to ancient humans had been building cities for thousands of years. And the knowledge for how to do this came about through what? Through trial and error experimentation. People would build something. What worked, they would keep and expand upon. What didn't work, those people often died, right? Those places went away. Their ideas were not transmitted to the next generation. By the time you get to ancient Rome, you have a period of development, or a style of development that have been honed over thousands and thousands of years of trial and error experimentation. And by the time you get to, my hometown in the early 1900s, you have an approach to building that is essentially universal. We can go to different continents, different cultures, different latitudes all over the world. And what we see is a very similar approach towards assembling places. One created over time through trial and error experimentation. When we look at this style of development, for most of us, this is all we've ever known, right? This is what development looks like. When I was a young engineer and I would ask questions about our development pattern, often the response I would get is, Chuck, this is the way it's always been done. But of course, this isn't the way it's always been done, right? It's a very new set of ideas, less than 100 years old. We didn't say, let's try this out in Nevada for a couple hundred years, see how it works on those like crazy people. We'll take the best ideas and we'll bring them here. What did we do? We just did this everywhere, all at once, across a grand landscape, reshaping not only the way we live, but the way we trade with each other, the way we interact with each other, the way we reach political and cultural decisions with each other. We threw off thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom on how to build places kind of honed and refined for us in favor of this brand new experimental approach that we thought would be in many ways better. What I want to talk about tonight are some of the financial implications of this shift. Things that were apparent to some at the time, but not really apparent to the broad cultural consensus. One of the things that we did early on at Strong Towns that got us a lot of kind of notoriety and really helped us get at that question of why are our cities struggling is to go out and evaluate different aspects of our development pattern. We would gather as much data as we could on different types of developments and see what we could figure out. And we had a particular focus, and this comes from me being a civil engineer and kind of understanding the complications that go into different street designs and what have you. We searched for places that had the least amount of white noise, the least amount of background noise possible, right? The fewest kind of variables going on that would throw off the analysis. For example, this is a dead-end cul-de-sac. Very, very simple. It's like the simplest style of development you'll have. A dead-end road, no through traffic, no commercial traffic. The only reason the road is there is to serve these homes along it. If the homes weren't there, no need for a road, right? When this was built, the city paid half the cost of the roadway. The property owners paid the other half. We asked the question, based on the taxes the city then collects from the people who live within this development, really the only people using this road in any meaningful way, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the half that they spent to build it? The answer is 37 years. Now, the road's not going to last 37 years. It's going to take the city that long to recoup it. At some point when it falls apart, they're going to have to come up with the money to fix it. Where's that money going to come from? Not from these property owners here. Here's another development, this one a little bit more intense, but the same kind of concept. There's a closed loop there with a dead-end cul-de-sac. No through traffic, no commercial traffic, just residential homes. This one was built by a developer. The developer paid for all the infrastructure costs. Those costs were then, of course, rolled over into the sale price of the home. People have been paying that on their mortgage for decades. They've also been paying their taxes to the city. The idea was we'll pay our taxes to the city will use that to fix our road. The road fell apart, the city went out to fix it, the cost was $354,000. We asked the question, based on the taxes the city collects from these property owners here, how long will it take them to recoup the money that they just spent to fix the road? The answer is 79 years. Now we then said, okay, let's say that between now and the time the road falls apart, we want to collect enough money from these taxpayers here in order to have the cash to go out and fix the road. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the water, the storm sewer, all that, vastly more expensive, right? Now sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, we get it. We know we lose money on residential property, we make it up on commercial. Commercial is kind of our cash cow. To which my response is always, like, I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of what it does and tries to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why an incorporated municipality would think that was a really good business strategy. But nonetheless, like, our cultural conversation is such that if we just have enough jobs, enough commercial growth, enough commercial buildings, it doesn't matter what happens in other parts of the system. This is a business park. This is one of those build it and they will come investments that cities like to do. We'll put in the wide streets, we'll put in the deep pipe, and we'll attract businesses to come in here and open up. This one was built, and a decade and a half later, every single lot was developed. And the city felt this was such a successful project, they wanted to repeat it, do the exact same thing on property they own right next door. We asked the question, if we could do the same thing for the same amount of money and get the same amount of investment, would this be a good project? In today's dollars, it costs $2.1 million. That's just what it cost then, adjusted to inflation. Today, we can go out and see there's $6.6 million of assessed value out in this park. Now pause for a second. Of the properties in this business park, 4 of them are a church. 2 of them belong to the school district. It's a bus maintenance building. 1 of them is a county maintenance garage, and 1 of them is a city maintenance garage. All of these are important community facilities, right? But none of them pay any taxes to the city. Of the remaining properties in the existing park, every single one of them was given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to build in this park. For the sake of our analysis, we tried running this every way we could. The only way we could make it cash flow was to assume that within 12 months of the new park being built, every single lot would be built on by a full tax-paying, non-subsidized entity, and that every penny of new taxes would go to retiring that bond. If that were the case, it would still take the city almost 3 decades, 29 years, to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would have to go up to pay to sweep the streets, fill the potholes, pay the police department, the fire department, and all the services that would be needed out here, and that's in the most wildly optimistic scenario. When I first went and met with that foundation and gave them this presentation, I was really proud of the work we had done. We had 18 of these examples I would go through and show them over and over. I found after many years of doing this presentation that there's diminishing returns to that. People start to cry. I can make the point with just 3. If you're someone who likes data and case studies, there's a bunch of them on our website. I'll give you that at the end, and you can go there and take a look at them. But let me walk you through what's going on here. And I'll apologize up front. I am an engineer, and I am a land use planner, and I do like charts. There are 3 charts in this presentation. They're the only 3 charts. If you hate charts, just hang with me for 3 charts. I promise this won't be too painful, all right? Let's say that a developer comes to our community, says, I have a piece of property here I would like to build upon. I will, at my expense, build all the commercial buildings. I'll build all the residential homes. I'll meet all of your requirements, your zoning requirements and your building code requirements. I'm not asking for any variances at all. I don't want any tax subsidies or handouts. I will build at my expense all the required roads and streets and curb and sidewalk. I'll put in the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters. I'll pay for all that. The only thing that I'm asking as a developer is that when I'm done making this investment in your community, that you, the city, right, the public, you agree that you will take over the long-term responsibility to provide service and maintenance to this. What would we say? What would we say?
Our actual city? We'd say, yeah.
We'd say, fantastic, right? We'd say, wonderful. This is ideal. We spend nothing, you spend everything, we get all this growth. What could be better? But let's say, we're smart people, we're prudent, we've heard of this strong town stuff, we want to do the right thing. So what we're going to do is when the money from this new development comes in, we're going to take the portion that would get siphoned off and spent fixing and maintaining stuff around the city, and we're just going to set that aside. And every year when that money comes in, we're going to set that portion aside, and we're going to save it for the day when we get out a couple decades and we got to make good on that promise we make when we do that development, that we will go out and we will take care of this stuff. Here's what that looks like. In year 1, everything is brand new. It hasn't cost you a penny. The new revenue comes in and you take that portion and you set it aside. In year 2, you add to what you had in year 1. In year 3, of course, you add a little more. Year 4, year 5, and on and on. And you can see a 5-year-old road isn't costing you anything, right? A 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing you anything. A 15-year-old pipe isn't costing you anything. So you go decades of just having money come in and nothing go out. You're feeling very, very rich. You've got a large pot of money there. The problem comes in this example in year 25, when we have to actually go out and make good on that promise. What we find is that the cumulative amount of money is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, we run far, far in the negative. Now, cities aren't one development, right? Cities are a collection of developments, a series of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes back in a couple of years after that first development and says, you know, that worked really well for me, it worked really well for you. I would like to do a similar size development. And every other year from this point forward, a developer walks in the door with a similar size development. In other words, nice, steady, continuous growth. The ideal thing that we'd all like to have in our cities. Just nice, steady, continuous, manageable growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day when we have to make good on all these promises we're making as we undertake these projects. Here's what that looks like. In year one, you've got your first project come online. It pays in the entire 25 years shown here. In year 3, you add a second one. It starts to pay in year 5 and year 7. And you can see, not only are we not having any expenses, but we're having all this growth. We're having growth upon growth upon growth. Our cash starts to accelerate upwards. And yeah, when we get to year 25, that year we have to make good on that very first promise we made way back in year 1, we got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? We've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money over the long term on every project that you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is the answer to that question. Why are cities struggling? Why, despite decades of growth and job creation and robust economic development, why, after all the infrastructure investments and things we've built, do we struggle just to do basic things? Why are our budgets so tight? This is the land of milk and honey. No one's experienced growth and prosperity at the level we've had, yet we can't keep the streetlights on overnight. We can't fix a pothole. We can't repair the sidewalks. Why? And I think more important, why could they do that in the past and we can't now? We get this narrative thrown at us all the time. Tom Friedman, he's a writer for the New York Times, fellow Minnesotan, wrote a book a few years back called This Used to Be Us, or That Used to Be Us. And it was a lament about all the things we used to do that we don't do anymore. They had a whole chapter on infrastructure. We used to have the best infrastructure in the world. We used to build all the great things. Now I go to China, they have all the new things. Our stuff is crap, it's all falling apart. That used to be us, what happened? Well, what happened is we live way out here now. Now we live way, way out here. At decades and decades and decades of unproductive development that costs us more in the long run than we were ever going to get back, those bills have started to come due. They've started to add up. And they're slowly and kind of silently choking our cities. I want to ask some questions about this right here. The first one is, do you recognize yourself in this chart? Do you recognize your own behavior? Because a lot of times, especially today when we have this kind of really dysfunctional national political dialogue, and that often filters down to our local political dialogues, it's very convenient to blame all these problems that we're having on someone else, right? If you're in the political right, you can look at the left and say, oh, they're profligate, they're no good with budgets, they don't care, they just spend us into oblivion. If you're on the left, you can look at the right and say, they're all into borrowing debt and giving big tax breaks to people, But do you recognize, separate yourself from that, do you recognize your own behavior here? This is why people smoke, right? This is why you'll go home tonight and have that bowl of ice cream and sit in front of the TV and watch the game instead of going for a walk, right? Boy, this ice cream is good. I really enjoying this show. Uh-oh, heart disease, right? This is a human flaw. This is a human failing. It's a failing that we all share. Psychologists call this temporal discounting or cognitive discounting. It's the human propensity to highly value positive feedback today and to deeply, deeply discount negative feedback in the future. We have adages around this, a bird in the hand, right? The whole idea is that we're wired this way. But the last presidential election we had, and I'm going to say something now. If you know that you are a reflexively partisan person, I'm not casting any aspersions on you, but if you know that your reaction to things is like a knee-jerk partisan reaction, for 60 seconds, dial that down, repress that instinct like down to 1, just for a minute, okay? Because I'm going to say something and I want you to hear it, but I don't want you to hear it with a partisan lens. When we look back at the last presidential election, we had two main political parties with figurehead candidates telling us, in my estimation, very similar things. They were explaining to us a narrative of what the best days that they remember and how we can do that again. Whether the best days they remember, these were two 70-year-old candidates too, right? And so for them, the best days they can remember, whether it was, Ozzie and Harriet families and blue-collar jobs, or whether it was a government in a position to expand Social Security and Medicare, whatever that period of time, for them, they could identify. Where was that in our history of this experiment? It was right there, right? It was right there. That was that period of time. We don't live there anymore. We live way, way, way out here. These are human failings we all share. Let me ask you one last question, then we'll move on. What happened to the civilization thousands of years ago that built their economy, their development pattern, their way of living around the exploitation of this human flaw? What happened to them? They went away. They failed. Their ideas were not transmitted to the next generation. They did not become the thing that was copied over and over and over. Those ideas died. We are in this really unique place where, after the Great Depression, after World War II, we were able to throw off the shackles that have kept humanity down for thousands of years. And in a way, this is great. Like, I'm not lamenting it. Like, I don't want to go back to, the plague and tuberculosis and, congested cities. Like, I'm not calling for that. But what we did is we shifted from an idea that wisdom of the ages, like, here's how you do things, that meant something, to if we have a thought, we can do it. If we have a dream, we can make it happen. If we build a bridge here and it doesn't work, we'll just build one a block over. At no point in history have humans had such affluence, such prolificacy, such ability to do whatever they wanted. I think it's important for us to understand that and grasp that we are in uncharted waters. Obviously, there's some huge implications here. The way we become accustomed to growing, those mechanisms are waning. When we look at the federal government and the ability of the federal government to come in and engineer growth at the local level, we look at the state government. I don't have to tell you this, your state is so broke. It's like ridiculous, right? I mean, we're 10 years into an economic recovery and our cities and states are still like ridiculously broke. Your state is pathetically broke. Like, I can't even explain how broke you are, right? We all understand this. What this mean for us at the local government level is that we are going to be forced to absorb the costs of our development pattern. If we want those roads fixed, we're going to have to pay for that. If we want that pipe repaired, that money is going to have to come from us. This can't be done in the current pattern of development without some incredibly large tax increases and or some devastatingly large cuts in services. And by cuts in services, I don't mean, we will put off maintenance for a couple weeks on that park, or we'll defer that road for another year. I mean, this pump goes out, all these people no longer get sewer. This road goes bad, it's not fixed, and these people have to figure something else out. I realize this is a debate we're having at every level of government, right? How big is the tax increase going to be? Who's going to pay? How big is the service cut going to be, and where is that going to be felt? It is really critical, sitting here in this room tonight, that we see the third variable in the sentence, the third variable being the current pattern of development. As long as we continue to build in a way that is functionally insolvent, there's no way that our cities will avoid insolvency. As long as we continue to build in a way that gives us an illusion of wealth today in exchange for enormous long-term liabilities, there's no way that our cities will avoid going broke. Whether that is a default like we see in places like Stockton and San Bernardino and Detroit, or whether it's a soft default like we see in thousands of cities across this country, where they lay off police and firefighters, they put off critical maintenance, they stop maintaining the parks because they just don't have the money. We have to start having a conversation about how we build places that are financially more productive. So how do we do this? I'm going to disappoint you right off the bat. Years ago, and I think it was 2014, I went to California. I was invited to speak in a couple places, and we did something very similar to what we did tonight. A bunch of other places called, and we strung over the course of a week. For those of you that know California geography, I started in Redding, and I gave 13 presentations, and 5 days later ended up in San Diego, which is a long way. It's a lot of In-N-Out burgers. And a lot of time behind the wheel, but gave a lot of presentations. And over and over and over, the Californians did something to me that I had not experienced in other parts of the country. They stood up at the end of the presentation, they said, "Chuck, you came here and scared the heck out of us." They actually use a different word. They use a California word. You scared the hell out of us. What's the solution? You didn't tell us the solution. Give us the solution. And I struggled with that. Like halfway through the tour, I was like tormented and depressed. Because we're going to talk the rest of the time here about how we look at this problem differently, how we act differently, how we do things differently. But at the end, they still wanted like a solution. And it took me a while of reflection to figure out that I just didn't speak Californian. Because what these Californians were asking me was something slightly different. What they were asking me is, what can someone else change about what they're doing so that I don't have to change anything about what I'm doing? There is no such solution that falls under that. And in fact, we've started to talk about this not as a problem that needs a solution, but a predicament that has a series of outcomes. A series of outcomes that we can respond to as rational, thoughtful people. And so instead of talking about solutions, at Strong Downs, what we talk about are rational responses. How do we, as thoughtful, caring, compassionate people, living together in a community, look at this complex set of problems arrayed in front of us that this experiment has brought us and respond as rational, thoughtful people? And I want to give you something to think about in terms of how we respond rationally, because I want to free you from like our current dogma and allow you to think as broadly as possible. And so I want to start with this photo here. This again is my hometown back in the early 1900s. And I got to tell you, when I first saw this photo, I was blown away. So this is amazing. Look at what these people built. You know, the planner in me sees how the buildings line up just perfect. They frame the public realm at this exact right ratios. There's great segmentation of the space. These buildings have great symmetry. They front the public realm in a perfect way. This is an exquisitely designed street. Let me ask you some questions about these people here. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and committees did you have to go to get an approval to build something? How many master plans had they put together? How much tax subsidy did they give out? How many federal grants did they get? How many state infrastructure loans did they receive? How many miles of infrastructure did they build in like a build it and they will come kind of way? How many engineers and planners and economic developers did they have on staff? Well, I can keep going. We can go through the litany of things that we have convinced ourselves are absolutely essential to building great places. They had none of them, none. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. These were a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. Look at what they built. How do they do this? It's really simple. They copied what they knew worked. They took the materials they had on hand and they built in a style that they had seen work for thousands of years around the world. They just copied what they knew worked. After decades and decades and decades of economic development, of investments, of infrastructure, of planning, of zoning, of great planners and engineers with all kinds of ideas on how to make this place great and successful and prosperous, here's what this exact same street looks like today. It's a wasteland of half-occupied buildings and parking. And if you want to grasp in one photo why our cities struggle, there's $500,000 of public infrastructure in that little stretch of street there. Where is the wealth that is going to sustain that generation after generation? I was giving a lecture in Boise at the university there, and I got to this photo, and a student raised their hand, stood up, and said, Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. We can't afford to build the way that you build here in the United States. When we build, we have to build one block at a time. And before we can build the next block, we have to make sure that every gap is filled in on the block we just built. Otherwise, we won't be able to afford it. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way. We're a very poor country now, too. We can't afford to build this way either. And for a long period of time, that illusion of wealth made us think that this kind of thing didn't matter. That we could just have huge gaps in the landscape, didn't matter. We could run pipe all over and interchanges and highways. We could have huge amounts of capacity that's never used. We could just be profligate because it created growth and the long-term ramifications would take care of themselves. It didn't matter. We were so rich. We didn't bother to think about it. I was actually asked this question yesterday on a radio show that I did. They asked me, why, if this is so obvious, has nobody else figured this out? Something along those lines. And here's the funny thing. I was at Harvard earlier this year with my friend Joe Minicozzi, who went to Harvard. I was there giving a lecture, and we were in the library in the basement of one of these buildings. And we were going through planning books from the early 1900s, from before this whole experiment. And do you know what it had in there? The planning books. They were not about zoning categories. They were not about where to run the infrastructure. Do you know what it was about? How do you calculate your financial productivity? How do you squeeze the most out of each block that you're building? How do you phase development so that you can pay for it? It was all obsessed with this stuff. Why were they obsessed with it and we're not? Because they were poor. And when you're poor, you have to make really good use of the stuff you have. We have felt so rich, we haven't had to. And literally, like, that thinking has gone away. Nothing I've showed you tonight is revolutionary. Nothing I've shown you tonight is beyond like a local planning department's ability, a local engineering department's ability to figure out. So we haven't had to ask the question because we've felt so rich. So, how do we start to change this? How do we start to change this awareness, this mentality? The first thing we need to do is get rid of our worst habits. Build it and they will come is a fantastic movie plot. It is a horrible economic development strategy. We are today in what we at Strong Towns call the desperation phase of this suburban experiment. If you, want to experience growth, if you want to be, a player in the game, you want to make things happen, what do you have to do? You as a city have got to have a department of people waiting to hand out tax subsidies if Google should come trolling through town. You got to have millions of dollars invested in shovel-ready sites, so that it's all turnkey for whoever walks in. This is not how cities build wealth. And this is not how communities have ever built wealth. I'm going to show you right now the very, very simple way that cities build wealth. If you were at my presentation today, don't keep this answer to yourself, because we did look at this photo today. And for the rest of you, take a look at this city here. Where is this city? What city is this? It's interesting because at the place we were at downtown today, there was a picture on the wall that looked very similar to this of Phoenix. This is not Phoenix, obviously, but there was a picture on the wall of basically like this version of Phoenix, and it looked eerily similar to this, eerily similar. Why did it look similar? Very simple. Every single city that was ever started in all of human history up to our current experiment began just like that. Phoenix began just like this. Dallas began just like this. Los Angeles began just like this. St. Louis, Minneapolis, Seattle, Chicago, Savannah, Atlanta, Boston, New York, Manhattan, at one point in the past looked just like this. London, Paris, Rome. There could be a picture of Romulus and Remus in a place looking just like this. This is what it looked like. Every city in all of human history started like this up until modern times. Some pop-up shacks, some hopes, and some dreams. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact. A lot of places like this failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does unemployment skyrocket? Does the stock market crash? Do we have to have an emergency bailout of Wall Street banks? No. These are little bets. A few people lose a little bit of money, they salvage what they can, they move on to the next place. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact. A lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple to understand way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. So after 30 years of incremental development, this little street, which is my hometown in 1870, would become that street I showed you earlier. And after another 40 years of growing incrementally out, incrementally up, and becoming incrementally more intense, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would be turned into buildings of brick and granite. We don't build wealth by going to the casino and putting it all on red. The way we build wealth as a community is by making modest investments over a broad area over a long period of time. Let me show you how powerful this approach is. These are 2 identical blocks in my hometown. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. If you look at them, you'll see they're the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, the same neighborhood, the same thoroughfare. Everything is the same except for the style of development. That old and blighted block looks like this. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks here. So what you're looking at is the 1920s equivalent of the pop-up shack. And had things progressed as they had for thousands of years, what would we expect to have happened? You would have eventually gotten 2nd and 3rd stories. The buildings would become more intense, more ornate. That's not what happened. What happened is that we had the Great Depression, then we had World War II, then we had a new style of development that just skipped right over this, started building out on the edge of town. These buildings have stagnated for almost a century now. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. The city had it labeled blight, got it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's drive-thru. Everybody was thrilled about this. right? This new drive-through restaurant got rid of blight. It looks good. It meets all the zoning requirements, all the setbacks, all the parking limits, all the green space ratios. It's got the right sign ordinance. We got rid of the on-street parking, so now the traffic flows more smoothly. We even got some native plants in the stormwater area. We got them to build a sidewalk. The sidewalk ends right there, but we got them to build that part. So you check off all the things that are a priority to the city. We met all of them with this. People were really happy. Here's what nobody bothered to consider. That old blighted rundown block had a total value of $1.1 million. When this was built, when the shiny new building was brand new, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, just a different style of development, is only worth $800,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, the way we built cities incrementally over thousands and thousands of years in different cultures, different continents, different latitudes, everywhere. You're looking at that development pattern in its infant phase after 90 plus years of neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. And everybody in this room knows what's going to happen to that taco joint, right? We've all been around long enough to see what happens to places like this. 20 years later, there'll be a new taco joint up the road. This one will be a used car lot. A decade later, we'll be boarded up. We'll be trying to get some type of tax subsidy to get it redeveloped. We've all been here, right? We've all seen it. In fact, in the subsequent years to this being built, here's what's happened to the property values. The city now collects 78% more taxes from that old and blighted block than the shiny and new. And by the way, we went out there and did interviews too. There's more jobs, there's more local ownership, and there's more churn in the community. We went and asked people, where do you bank? Where do you advertise? Who's your insurance carrier? Where do you buy your products? Where's your suppliers? And guess what? In that old and blighted block, where do they come from? The community. That shiny and new one, where do they come from? Wyoming. This is what we've done to the inside of our cities. We've done the same thing out on the edge. This is our Mills Fleet Farm complex, a double-sized big box store, auto dealership, gas station. This is the most valuable piece of property in the entire Brainerd Lakes area. When these people show up to a meeting, we just stop the meeting and ask them, like, what do you guys need, right? You guys, I know you don't have Mills Fleet Farm here. Please tell me that someone in this room has been to a Mills Fleet Farm, please. Like, really, okay? Where? You're from Minnesota? Wow, where from?
Eden Prairie.
Oh, okay, Eden Prairie, home of like the huge football sign. Did you? So my brother and sister-in-law live in Eden Prairie, and my brother-in-law's brother, so whatever that would be, was the principal of the Eden Prairie High School, and that was the thing. Like, you know, from up in Brainerd, we're really proud because we got fireworks when our football team scores. They have like the Friday Night Lights, crazy thing. But Eden Prairie is a very nice place. So you've been to Mills Fleet Farm. You've been to Mills Fleet Farm. Correct me if I'm wrong. Brainerd's first of all the home of Mills Fleet Farm. I don't know if you knew that. No, it's the little silo out front. You know what we're talking about. So Mills Fleet Farm. If you ever get to Minnesota, you got to go. It's a cultural experience. When you go in one, here's the product mix. You've got auto parts, animal feed, lumber, guns and ammo, camouflage lingerie. That's what you'll find, and they're wildly popular, right? So this is the most valuable piece of property in the entire area. Here's 20 acres, exact same size area of our core downtown. Either you ever been to Brainerd? No? Someday. Brainerd's downtown struggles mightily. If you've seen the movie Fargo, you've seen a not so flattering but not so inaccurate portrayal of my downtown. A lot of the second, third stories are empty. A lot of the first stories struggle. We're doing a lot better. Things are getting better, but they certainly have a long way to go. In my lifetime, I'm only 45 years old. Lots of buildings that have been burned down and torn down in the downtown, nothing new that's been built. So to give you some context to what's going on. When we look at the 20 acres out on the edge, we see a value of $600,000 per acre, a huge sum of money. It's a very important piece of property. But when we go to that 20 acres downtown, the same size area, just a different configuration, what we see is a value that's 78% greater. How much did my generation spend to get that development out on the edge? We spent a couple $100 million on the bypass. We spent tens of millions running sewer and water out here, millions on frontage roads and backage roads. How much did my generation spend to get that wealth in that 20 acres downtown? That was wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their peers built slowly and incrementally over time and bequeathed to us as like an endowment of sorts, right? That we could just milk down over the years, which is what we've done, right? What happens when Mills Fleet Farm goes out of business? Don't tell anyone in Minnesota I said that, because it's heretical back home. But what happens when it goes out of business? When we don't have the Hudson Bay Company anymore, like businesses come and go, at some point that won't be there anymore. What comes next? I don't know, but we can look around at similar kind of stores and see what happens when they reach the end of their life cycle. And what we know is that whatever comes next, a warehouse, a Salvation Army, a church, whatever it is going to be lower on the economic food chain than what's there now. This is the peak. That's the peak. There are 134 different properties in that core downtown. What happens when one of them loses a tenant? Or someone goes out of business? Or someone retires? What happens when, in our infinite wisdom, we figure out that we have too much retail space and not enough office space? Or too much office and not enough residential? Well, these buildings are incredibly flexible. They're highly adaptable. They have been, in just my life, many, many different things. I've seen places become pizza shops and go to attorneys' offices. I've seen a dentist place become a clothier. These buildings are highly adaptable. There is a reason why our ancestors, and I say that in the broadest possible sense of the term, our ancestors for thousands of years around the world built in this fashion. It's highly adaptable, it's highly flexible, and it's incredibly productive financially. In a word, this is a really strong pattern of development. I've shown you two sites. I'm going to show you some cities now because we see this same trend over and over and over. This is the work that my friend Joe Minicozy at Urban 3 has done. What they have done is they have modeled thousands of cities across the country, looking at where is the greatest level of financial productivity. So think of a farmer going out and spreading seed across the field. The parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most financially productive part of the field. Or I'm sorry, that's the most productive part of the field. When we look at a city, financial productivity, we're talking not bushels per acre, but like value per acre. Where are we creating the most value per acre in our cities? What parts of our cities are the most financially productive? So I'm going to start with Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York is kind of the antithesis of Phoenix. Since World War II, every single year they have lost population. Every single year, including last year, they lost population. It's been a continual downward process. If you were to move to Buffalo today, they would sell you a house for $1 if you agree to live there 5 years and fix it up. Okay? It's a very poor place. Very poor place. Yet, when we step back and we look and say, all right, in Buffalo, New York, despite the decline and the neglect, where is the most productive property? Can you point to the historic downtown? And not only does it remain a repository of wealth, look at how it dwarfs everything around it. Everything around it. We see this in cities of all sizes. Here's a mid-sized city. In upstate New York, we see the same kind of thing. Here's a very small town by where I live. This is about 1,200 people. When I first went to this place, they said, Chuck, we've got great stuff happening out here. We've got great stuff happening out there. This stuff in these neighborhoods here are horrible. We got to figure out a way to get this stuff torn down and rebuilt. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. In all those poor neighborhoods. and the neighborhoods where all the poor people live. Now we're back to Lafayette, and I'm doing okay on time. I could spend 2 hours on this slide here. I'm going to try to do this in a reasonable amount of time because I've got a couple other things I want to show you. But this one is so important. What we did in Lafayette is we went out and we analyzed every single source of income they had. And we analyzed every single expense that they had, and we annualized them. So if a road is here, it's cost this much, it's going to last 25 years. What does that mean every year? That kind of thing. And we assumed that everything was being taken care of and maintained. And we had a whole bunch of maps that we put together, and at the end, we mashed them all together in a kind of a final, what you could think of as a profit and loss statement for the city. Here are the parcels where you're making money, where they're paying more in revenue to the city than it costs to provide service to. And here are the parcels where you have to pay more to provide them service than they create in revenue for the city. I apologize to those of you that are red and green colorblind because this map means less to you than to everyone else. I will do my best to translate it to everybody. For those of you that do see red and green, red is, we use accounting terms, so you're in the red, you're losing money, you're in the green, you're making money. Let me walk you through this map. For those of you that are not seeing it, I'm gonna try to go slow and point this out. So right above my head right now, there's a spike that goes really high. By the way, the higher the spike, the more the disparity is. That spike I just stood underneath is green spike. It is a development called River Ranch. It's a new urbanist development. And by new urbanist, what I mean is traditional building style with modern financing techniques. So narrow streets, tight lots, but everything built all at once to a finished state. What we see historically with this pattern of development, not the new urbanist part, but the modern finance part, what we see in standard kind of suburban development is that these places don't hold their value well over time. When you build all at once to a finished state, what happens is 25, 30 years later, you have this echo effect. Everything is built within like 2 or 3 years of each other. 25 years later, everybody's roof fails at the same time. Everybody's driveway goes bad at the same time. Everybody's water heater stops working within a couple years of each other. There's this huge financial downward pressure on a neighborhood all at once. The way that we used to handle that in the traditional development pattern was how? Well, first of all, everything was assembled incrementally, so there was not like one big echo. It was kind of a rolling echo. And we also allowed things to incrementally grow to the next step. So if you were in a neighborhood that was being assembled incrementally, and you had the one home where the kind of got into disrepair and went down, that became a prime property to purchase and redevelop. To take that single family home or that small place and turn it into a duplex. And now you had the duplex in the incrementally assembled neighborhood. This drove the underlying land values, which in turn drove redevelopment. There was a cycle there. And decline was a natural part of it because decline became an opportunity. Today, we build all at once to a finished state. You are in a neighborhood of single-family homes. You will forever, world without end, be in a neighborhood of single-family homes. It will not change. And so when they go into decline, there's no natural way to arrest that. There's no mechanism to go in and buy that house that's in a neighborhood that's all kind of feeling stressed at the same time. Buy that house, invest in it, rent out the basement, and use that cash to fix the roof. That's not an option for us today. And so what happens is that these neighborhoods tend to go into terminal decline. They'll hang on for a while. They'll maybe come out and get the city inspector to make this guy mow his yard or fix that up. But it's just a timing thing. And there's this continual downward pressure. And what happens is that the people who are affluent in that neighborhood, they can pick up on the signals very early. What do? They move to the next place. In 2000, we had 1,100 census tracts in persistent poverty in this country. In the 2010 census, that was up to 3,300, 3 times. There's a projection right now that we will be almost to 9,000. Almost all of that growth is in suburban places that were once like the place to be. At Strong Towns, we've done this series on Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri is a fascinating place for many reasons. One of the reasons is that the demographic and cultural makeup of the city, which tends to be very poor, doesn't match the cultural demographic makeup of the police department. Why is that? Why is that? It's because when the people got hired in the police department, they did match the makeup of the city. And they stayed because of pensions. And while the neighborhood went into decline, understand, Ferguson in 1950s and 60s was the suburb to be. It was like the rich, it was the rich suburb where everybody with money moved to. Then it started to get that echo and went into decline, and those people all moved on, except for the public employees. They stayed because they had pensions. They had to stay. And so now today, you can sit and look and see that like the people running the city not only don't represent the demographic makeup of the community, but they've been there a long time, and they remember how it used to be, right? This is what we've done. In Lafayette, you've got this one development that financially is doing great. Will it continue into the future? History tells us not, but right now it's doing really, really well. To the east of that is a whole area right in the center here that's all green. If you can see just to the east of that spike, right in the middle, there's a green cluster. That is Lafayette's core downtown. Nobody, if you go visit someone in Lafayette, Louisiana, they're not likely to take you downtown. They certainly would not take you downtown to sightsee and take photos. It's kind of a place that struggles. I like it. I think they're doing some good things. They have good intentions. They've got some decent plans to make it better. They've got some great Zydeco bars. You can go get a taco for like 99 cents, But this is not a place that is really doing great. Financially, it's doing fantastic. The eye test, very much not. To the east of that, there's a crescent of green that runs from right down here up to the equivalent kind of up on the top up there. It's a crescent of green. What is that right there? Those are the poor neighborhoods. Those are the poorest neighborhoods in town. Those are the neighborhoods where when we were going to work in the city and we were going to get an Airbnb, the city staff said, dude, don't go to those neighborhoods. That's where the homicides happen, the burglaries happen. That's the poor part of town. Stay away from there. Financially, doing fantastic. Everything else on this map is red. All the stuff down here, all the stuff out here on the west, all the stuff up here on the north and the east over here, all this is red. Those are the big box stores, the strip malls, the mall, the drive-through franchise restaurants, the windy cul-de-sac subdivisions, the three-car garage with the attached house. That's what all that is. If you live in Lafayette today, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. They'll pay other taxes to the school district and the parish and what have you, but $1,500 goes to the city. In order for the city to make good on every promise they have made, to maintain every road and pipe, to provide police and fire protection, to keep the transit system running, to do all the stuff that they have promised their citizens they will do over time, median taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 that a Lafayette family makes, the median family, would need to go back to the city just to tread water, just to maintain the stuff they've already built. That will not happen. There's no chance it will ever happen. And so the future of Lafayette is actually, in some ways, very, very clear. There's a city in this country that has gone through this really hard process, right? We don't have enough money to maintain the neighborhood, so we don't. We don't have enough money to fix this pipe, so it doesn't get fixed. What city am I talking about? We all know it's Detroit, right? We've all seen this. If you haven't been there, you still understand the pain. And we look at Detroit and we say, that can't possibly be us. And I talk to people all over the country, and everybody has an explanation about why we're not Detroit. If your view of the world is right of center, you have an entire right of center narrative to explain Detroit. If you're left of center thinking, you have an entire left of center narrative to explain Detroit. Those two narratives have very little overlap, but they're internally consistent, right? I'm going to give you the strong towns narrative of Detroit. Back in the early 1900s, Detroit was experimenting with becoming the Auto City, USA. And there was a satellite cities around this, the Garys, Flints, all these other places that were kind of associated with this new idea of manufacturing the automobile at scale and having it become a tool of middle-class prosperity. Detroit was the first one. Detroit was the first one to have commuter suburbs where people would live outside of town and drive in. They were the first ones to tear down the buildings to build parking lots. They were the first ones to have this kind of reconfiguration of the outskirts of the community and the change in economics that went with it in order to make use of the automobile in a broad middle-class way. And when we got to the Great Depression and cities started to fold, hundreds of cities, I want to say even thousands of cities, but I know it's hundreds, declared bankruptcy during the Great Depression, defaulted on their debt. Horrible, horrible time for municipalities. One city kind of stood out as being kind of defy the odds prosperous. That was Detroit. And by the time we got to the end of World War II, and you had the presidents like Council of Economic Advisors and top economists saying, the sky is falling, as soon as these troops demobilize and come home, as soon as we stop the war production, we're just going to slide right back into depression. There's nothing that's going to keep us from going right back to where we were. Nothing has structurally changed. What changed is that we all copied Detroit. We all took what they did and said, we're going to do that here. We're the exact same as Detroit. Detroit's just 20 years ahead of us. They're just early. They've just arrived at the logical destination of that Ponzi scheme. When you build in an insolvent way, you get to a point where your city is insolvent. That's Detroit. They're not defective people. They're not greedy people. They didn't do something horribly wrong. They're just like us. They just got there ahead of us. I want to show you some buildings because part of this change in our thinking is seeing the potential in places where we overlook it today. These are two buildings in North Carolina. They could be here. We've modeled these all over the continent. They're the same kind of numbers. You've got a Kmart at $384,000 an acre, a Walmart at $967,000. But you shift to the downtown, you've got an old warehouse converted into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And my favorite little place here, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. It's hard in Phoenix. It's hard throughout the whole Southwest. I did an interview with your public radio station today, and I hope I explained this well, because I hope this makes it on the air. It is hard to not experience the community. It's hard to not experience the community at speeds less than 20, 30, 40 miles an hour. Pretty much all of our experiences in the community are at speeds much faster than a walking speed. And when we experience the vast majority of our community at that speed, what we don't grasp fully is the level of gaps that exist in our city. Oppressive gaps. I realize it is brutally hot here. It's brutally hot. I don't think I could make it a week in this place. I'm sorry. I love you all. It's brutally hot here. But I'm going to challenge you. Maybe do this late at night when it's not so hot. Get out of your car. Get out of your car and walk. And don't walk here. Don't walk in this little place that's kind of like, your version of like downtown Disneyland, right? You try to create like, hey, look, we have walkable, pop-up walkable stuff here. You know, it's like far downtown. Go a mile that way. Go a mile that way. And then walk a mile. And when you're walking it, take note of the gaps, the huge amounts of unused space. And do it as an engineer. Look down and say, every foot that I walk, you know, this street out here, $2,500 a foot, at least, with the rail and everything there. Go out there a little bit, you're still talking $1,000 a foot. When you've got those 4-lane stroads that are one direction, you're talking like $1,500, $2,000 a foot. Do that. $2,000, $4,000, $6,000, $8,000, and then look at what's there. Nothing. It is oppressive. Once you start to see it, you will not be able to shut it off, and it will become overwhelmingly oppressive to you. Let me ask you a question. Do you here in Phoenix have the wherewithal, have the know-how, have the ingenuity, have the capacity to build something as refined and sophisticated as Jimmy's Pizza? Because that's where you start. That's the gap filler. That's that next increment. The next increment from gap is that. That's it, right there. That's what you do. And you have the capacity to do that. Tomorrow, when I'm with the rural people who have a much smaller system, much poorer places, I'm going to tell them the same thing. You have the ability to do that tomorrow. There's nothing holding you back from making that happen. You have the capital, you have the wherewithal, you have the sophistication. When you do it, look at how much wealth you're going to build out of places that are just costing you money today. And not only the wealth, what kind of opportunity are you going to create? We all know where the profits for this place goes, right? And I'm not disparaging them. They have created a business model perfectly adapted to the style of development that we have expressed we want in our communities. You can hate big box stores, and you can hate Walmart, and you can hate all these people. It's misplaced anger. They have perfectly adapted themselves to the development pattern that you have implemented. If we start building like this, where do the profits for Jimmy's Pizza go? They go to Jimmy. And who is Jimmy? Well, Jimmy is your neighbor. Jimmy goes to church with you. His kids go to school with your kids. He volunteers on the PTA. He has a float in your 4th of July parade. He sponsors a softball team. He banks at the local bank. He buys his insurance from a local insurance agent. He might source his ingredients from someone here locally, if he can. We're no longer a rich country. And our political game today is to make us feel as if we still are. At the local level, once we recognize where we're at, once we recognize that we're just on the road to Detroit, that is our destiny. It should create a sense of urgency in us, where we don't see Jimmy's Pizza as failure. We see Jimmy's Pizza as like the first step to something greater. I want to tell you one more story, and this one is about Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee is one of these places, very much like Detroit, that shows up on all those lists you don't want to be on, right? Out-of-wedlock births, poverty rate, homicide rate. But Memphis, Tennessee is a beautiful place. If you get a chance to go to Memphis, just go and experience it. It is a beautiful, wonderful place, full of people who just have like a love for life. You know, we go to cities around the country and they talk about how can we build social capital. Memphis is poor financially. Social capital, I know of no place richer. No place richer. In Memphis, there's this little block called Broad Avenue. Broad Avenue was a former streetcar stop. In the 1950s, they ripped out the streetcar. They ran a highway through the middle of the neighborhood. Without the streetcar traffic, without the neighbors walking back and forth, these blocks just died. All the stores were empty. Nothing was being used. Some neighbors today, fed up with the decline, fed up with the neglect, went out. They took matters into their own hands. They worked with the shop owners to get them swept out. They swept up the sidewalks. They put out planters and benches. They painted their own crosswalks. They painted their own bike lanes. For one weekend, they did a demonstration project where they invited businesses from around the community to come in and open up. They had a clothier, they had an ice cream stand, they had a bike shop, they had an art gallery. They didn't go ask for permission from the city. They didn't go get Department of Health inspections. They didn't get any permits. They just said, by the time we're done showing people what could happen and someone gets mad, by the time anybody comes out, we're going to be gone anyway. So let's just do it. And they did. And this isn't the nicest block in all of Memphis, but it's a heck of a lot nicer than it was before they started. I wasn't out here for this project, but they brought me out here 6 months afterwards and showed me what had happened. 6 months later, every storefront that had been vacant before this project was now filled. I talked to some of the landlords. They told me they were able to charge double the amount of rent for the last place to go than what they were asking before the project started. The city's since gone out, documented 18 new businesses, 32 new jobs, $12 million of property value appreciation. Total public investment, 0. We have become so obsessed with chasing the big dollar project that we have completely overlooked the nickels, pennies, and dimes that are just laying there in our neighborhoods waiting to be picked up. We not only discount the Jimmy's Pizza, we discount the simple little things that would improve people's quality of life and unleash all kinds of private capital and investment. This is a little report I wrote in my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. We spent a summer in a neighborhood looking at ways where people struggled and saying, we don't have a lot of money. What's a small thing we could do right now to start to address these struggles? We saw a mom walking through the ditch, weeds up to her waist, pushing a stroller. What are you doing? Well, I've got to get to the grocery store today. I don't have a car. It's not safe to walk on the street. I'm walking here. We saw the elderly woman walking with a walker down the middle of the street, climbing over mounds of snow. What are you doing? I've got to get to the pharmacy today. I don't have a ride. The sidewalk's not shoveled. So I'm walking here where I can. We started to document these things. At the end of the year, we put together a report, 8 little projects the city could do to change the course of this neighborhood. 8 little investments to improve the quality of life and induce property value appreciation and wealth creation within the neighborhood. I went to the city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. You know what he said? Why would you say that, Chuck? We're so comfortable sitting behind a desk. We're so comfortable putting out a community survey or having a meeting where we bring people in and have them, do sticker charts up on the walls. What would you like to see? What would you like to see happen? And what we're missing is the essence of what's going on in our places. That was just a fine way of building when our approach was, how do we repeat this over and over and over again? How do we keep our country from falling back into depression after World War II? How do we create an assembly line that can grind out community after community after community, square mile after square mile after square mile? We've done that. It's over. We built way, way more than we can ever take care of. And the challenge we have now is not how do we do that over and over and over again, but how do we make great use of the stuff we've already built? We're going to have fewer lane miles a decade from now than we have today. We're going to have fewer miles of pipe 2 decades from now than we have now. We are going to have a smaller footprint in the future than we have today. How do we answer that question of where? It's an impossible question to answer. Are we going to get rid of your neighborhood? Are we going to get rid of your neighborhood? Is your neighborhood the one that's going to fail? How do we decide that? It's an impossible question. The way we decide it is we switch from a model of building over and over and over again, repeating what we've done, manufacturing more and more Phoenix, bankrupting ourselves in the process. And we start to go back and say, how do we make better use of this stuff that we've already built? How do we fill in these oppressive gaps? Where in our community are the people who want to run a Jimmy's Pizza or a shop of that size? Where can a collection of those emerge? Where can we fix where people are walking and make it a little bit easier so we can connect the shops that sit right up here with the poor people who live right down here and make life better for all of them? If we can shift our approach, if we can humble ourselves to go out and look at our communities differently, to ask, where are people struggling? Where are these gaps? If we can humble ourselves and adapt ourselves to that line of questioning, not only can we position ourselves to make the lowest risk, highest returning public investments that it is possible to make, but we cannot help but improve people's lives in the process. That's what a Strong Towns approach is all about. Thank you, everybody. So, that worked out really well. I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm happy to do that. I love Q&A. So someone gave me a hard one today, and I've still been thinking about it. I'm going to write about it because it was really great. Before we take questions, if you've got a question, you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and I'll repeat it for the camera because they're recording this. I always get people who say, like, Chuck, this is really great. What can I do? We are creating a movement of people around the country to talk about these things differently, to change the narrative in the communities. We realize that the best thing that we can do is not go out and do consulting with this city or that city. The scale of the problem is much bigger than that. We need to have a cultural conversation of change. So if you are inspired by our message, if you want to help us, if you really think this is important, the number one thing you can do is leave this room tonight and go tell someone about it. Tell someone else about it. And if you want help doing that, our website, strongtowns.org, we're publishing 3 articles a day. I guarantee you'll go on there and you'll find something interesting in a very short period of time. Send that to somebody you know. Say, hey, I was here last night, I heard this, I think you would like this message. If you're interested in getting a copy of our slides, if you're interested in getting a video of this presentation in different formats, if you go to this website, strongtowns.org/chat, and fill out your email address right now, that will be like magically emailed to you tonight while you sleep by people smarter than me. That will all happen. If you're really, really inspired by what we do and you really, really want to help, go out of here and tell someone else about it, and then go to our website and sign up to become a member. We have 2,400 members across this country. Membership is how we sustain our organization. Membership allows us to share this message with more and more places. And so thank you to the people in this room who are already members of the organization. I know there's a bunch of you here, and I'm just very grateful. If anybody has a question, I'm more than happy to try. Please.
So we have a mayor race coming up, and I've heard 4 candidates talk about their priorities, and either number 1 or number 2, they all listed it as infrastructure, and they all explained it as repairing streets. So what are some follow-up questions to that we should be asking them to kind of dig deeper into that?
That's a great question. So the mayor's race is coming up. A lot of the candidates are saying infrastructure is a big problem. What's the question that we ask them to get them kind of, discern who gets it from who doesn't? This is a thing across the country because when you poll public officials, the number one issue for public officials across the country by like a 3-to-1 margin is infrastructure. And it's because infrastructure is like the problem they don't have a solution for. Generally what happens at the local level is the engineer will come forward and say, okay, we're spending $4 million a year on road repair. That's got to go to $40 million if we're going to catch up. And you're like, I have no way of processing that. And so the issue becomes like, we got to fix this somehow. Here's the question that I would ask to get to and discern on whether people are thinking about this the right way. When you fix infrastructure, how are you going to get more value out of that? How are you going to increase the return on those investments? How are you going to make it more than just, it's black road today, it's going to be a black road tomorrow? That's the question that I ask. And if they get it, they will immediately say, we've got to configure this so that we're getting more private investment, we're getting more wealth creation, we're getting more use out of this stuff. And so that may mean a narrower street, it may mean a different street configuration, it may mean a different design. I gotta get urban designers in there, I gotta get people who know how to build wealth, I gotta get our ordinances changed and fixed so that we can build a Jimmy's Pizza and not have that take a 9-month process of begging and variances to get it done. I gotta have the next increment be allowed by right in every neighborhood. These are the ways that I would answer that question. And I think if you can get them talking that way, then you've got a good mayor candidate. Please. No, you go ahead. I was pointing at you because you're gonna be next.
So it seems the problem with a lot of those developments we started talking about is the fact that we're just valuing them wrong. We're assessing what the potential, the problem with that 25-year cutoff is that we didn't pay for it in the first 25 years, right? So, like I saw this study on every publicly financed arena since 1980. None of them have met their sales, like what the projected revenue is.
Right,
Every single
right.
one has not generated
Right.
the projected revenue.
Right.
So how do we start getting better at actually projecting that? That seems like that's
No, that's a great question. How do we get, when we do these developments, it just seems like they don't work out, like we're not very good at projecting. How do we get better at projecting? Here's how I would answer that question. You admit that you can't project. you say, to quote Yogi Berra, projections are really hard, especially about the future. And you just say, like, we can't do it. I think the more sophisticated question comes from Nassim Taleb, which he's a writer that I've read everything he's written. If I were going to recommend one book to people to understand strong downs thinking, it would be Nassim Taleb's Black Swan or Anti-Fragile. These are fantastic books. Here's the way that he would answer that question. How do you live in a world where you can't reliably project the future? Here's the great answer to that question. Our ancestors figured that out. When I talked about the traditional development pattern being adaptable and flexible, being built in increments, being very productive financially, what they did is they built in a style where if their thoughts about the future were wrong, the downside was really limited. And if things worked out great, the upside potential was huge. What we have done now is we've created a development pattern where the upside potential is limited and the downside potential is negative, is disastrous. It's a fragile approach. So I don't think the challenge we have is to become better at projections. I don't think we ever will, and I don't think we should strive to. I think it's a fool's quest. I think what we have to do is actually have a development pattern that is immune to our own error. And that's really what the traditional development pattern is. Please.
So your timeline chart that said 2 life cycles of the infrastructure, what really resonated with me is that in the Phoenix region, we really boomed with the advent of the air conditioner.
Right.
I mean, we haven't really even hit the 2 life cycles
No.
yet. We're just beginning to.
It's just starting to.
Right. And what I find really interesting in our industry is that people are using the recession as the reasoning why things have slowed.
Right. No.
And that once things pick up, we'll be back at it.
I know.
And my question for you, since you kind of talk across the region or across the country about this, is how do you dispel that? I mean, other than an hour and a half presentation. The question is, like, we have people here even today who look back and say, we had this recession in 2008, boy, the after effects are really difficult still. As soon as we get back on our feet, we're gonna be right back to where we were, and things will be going gangbusters again. Here's what I've come to grasp about that particular delusion and associated delusions. If you want to believe that, there's no amount of reason that will convince you otherwise. There's a great psychologist named Jonathan Haidt who talks about human reasoning. And basically, he makes a very convincing argument that we are slightly evolved chimpanzees. Humans are, that's what we are. And what we are prone to do is think with our hearts and basically have what he calls the elephant, which is like our innate sense of what should happen. And then we use our rider, which is our reason, to explain our actions. It's not the other way. And we would like to think we work the other way. We would like to think, well, I'm a reasonable person. I think reasonably, and then that's what I do. No, we all do the opposite. We all do the opposite. We do, and then we ad hoc explain it afterwards in our brain. So how do we get through to people when like a reason argument doesn't work is really what I feel like you're asking. And I think the way we do that is, let me talk about it on a micro scale and a macro scale. If it's a micro scale, if it's you and me having this conversation, I have to empathize with you. I have to understand your situation. I have to understand why you believe that. Even though it's crazy, right? I have to understand why you believe that. And I have to acknowledge that and acknowledge why it's real to you. Because I'm not gonna have a conversation with you unless we can have that meeting. And then I just have to, I'm very sorry, but if we could go back to 2004, that was a bubble and it burst. And we don't really wanna live in a bubble, do we? Okay? Now, from a macro standpoint, I think from a public policy standpoint, we've got to be pretty vocal about this. Let's try this experiment. 2001 to 2008 was a housing bubble, right? 2010 to 2018 is a housing recovery. It's the same, if you look at like the Case-Shiller index, it's the same point. Right? We've in post hoc labeled a bubble because we can see that in the past, that was a bubble, nasty. And now today we've done the same exact thing and we're in the same exact spot nationwide in a macro sense, and we call it a recovery. Why? Because it's more comfortable for us. I think we have to be able to point out those logic things. I think everyone at the end of the day, I was just going to use like an Alice in Wonderland reference. I think at the end of the day, and I'm kind of I'm an optimist when it comes to humanity, and I realize that not everybody is, but I am. I do feel like we're all more comfortable living in our own comfort bubble and not confronting the fact that we label something a bubble and something a recovery, and it's only because of our proximity to it. And we want it to be true. We want it to be a recovery, even though we can see it's like clearly just the second bubble. That being said, I think that everyone at the end of the day wants to live in a world that's real and safe and secure. And I think if we can talk about these things, not just in terms of math and numbers, but in terms of like, what does a secure future look like? Don't you have tension and anxiety over the fact that this is a really fragile thing we've built? How do we keep it from falling apart? How do we make it secure so that you can sleep at night knowing that the value you have in your house is real? It's not going to just evaporate tomorrow because of some crazy thing. I think if we can start to humanize our macro conversation in that way in our communities, we can start to shift the cultural consensus. There will always be people. I think this is easiest to understand with like walking and biking. I do a lot of talks with biking and walking groups. And the question I always get is, how do you convince people who drive Hummers today and live way out of town to bike and walk? And I'm like, you never will. But why do you want like the 99th percentile person to act like the 1 percentile person? Like, you don't. What you're trying to get is like the 1 percentile person to not be lonely. You want them to have like the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 percentile person there with them and start building a culture of biking and walking. And ultimately have that be enough of a force where it doesn't matter how loud and vociferous the 1% over here with the Hummer is. They're going to be part of like a shrinking coalition of a cultural mindset. I think the same thing goes for your conversation. I don't think we're ever going to get the developer who builds tract housing out on the edge of the community to wake up one day and go, oh my gosh, I have just wasted the last 40 years of my life. And not only that, but I like bankrupted this city that I love. What a horrible thing I've done. I think you do stand a chance to get them to wake up one day and go, wow,
building incrementally near the downtown in these core neighborhoods is like a way better investment than what I'm doing now. And I see all my peers and competitors making a ton of money doing that and being really successful. And my stuff feels really fragile, and the buyers I'm getting are not as good, and the market doesn't move as fast. Maybe I should shift my business approach. Please, in the back.
Yeah, I want to know how green spaces fit into the mall that you're talking about, because even in a relatively compact area like downtown,
Yeah.
value those green spaces we've got on that side, we've got Martha's Square here, and we still want that place to be a place of space, a place where we can be at.
Right.
How does that figure into a model where you really want to make the most of every block incrementally off the parks and green spaces?
Yeah. So how does green space fit into this? It's a really, really good question. And I would encourage you to contemplate two cities and their examples of this. Because we came up with an adage in regards to green space that I think is kind of universally true in this setting. And it's this: if you are building a park or green space or what have you with a parking lot, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. And what I'm really trying to say there, the two cities I'd like you to contemplate are Savannah, Georgia, which has integrated small little green spaces within the fabric of the community. And then also on a bigger scale, contemplate Central Park in New York City. If we were to model these in a Joe Minicozy Urban 3 kind of productivity model, what you would find is that those are like vacant holes, right? Like those places don't create a lot of wealth, they don't create a lot of productivity. But you can see very obviously what they do, right? They make everything around it like so incredibly valuable. We could cut up Central Park today and block it off and create like extra Manhattan. And what would happen is that property values in Manhattan would crater. It's that back and forth between the green space and the private investment and the interaction between them that builds the wealth that justifies, in a sense, the park. They play off each other. I think a good way to think of a park, you can think of it, I was going to say a fire, but that might not be a good analogy here. Think of it like a radio beacon, right? It's transmitting wealth. And the further you are away from it, the worse the reception gets. If you're right next to it, like it generates a lot of wealth. Your goal with that park is to have it generate wealth as far as it can, with the greatest magnitude it can. That means that the interface between the park and the surrounding neighborhood needs to be fantastic. The interface between the neighborhood and the flow back and forth of humans, not people in cars, but humans walking back and forth, the further you can make that as seamless as possible, the more the wealth of that green space will reflect out throughout the neighborhood. These places, when they pay for each other many times over. Central Park is an easy sell, an easy thing to maintain with the wealth of Manhattan next to it. The green spaces in Savannah are easily justifiable by the tax base that's created around them because those parks are so great. I think what we do incorrectly is that we have tended to look at parks as amenities, almost as like recreational amenities for our community, as opposed to like essential components of creating wealth. I'm not talking about, you need great parks and they need to function really well. They need to build the wealth in the community. I'm not talking about making them fundamentally that much different. But I think a good way to think of it is if you're building parking lots at your park, you're not radiating wealth from them the way you should be. How are we doing? Go ahead, please.
In your presentation, you have both urban spaces with lots and lots of holes, but you also have small towns that have, the infrastructure of the main street. And I know you're going to do some rural talking. I was just in Miami and Globe over the weekend.
Yep.
These are two towns in Arizona. Gosh, Miami has an incredible old main street. There's like maybe two businesses open.
Yeah.
It is dead.
Yeah.
It's totally dead. Town is
Mm-hmm.
and yet it has, it is a beautiful place.
Right.
Any
Right.
in many ways.
Let me try to rephrase that so that we're all on the same page here, and tell me, what do we do about the small town problem, where we have like places that are beautiful and have functional capacity, but there's just no there's no inertia there. The life is being sucked out of them. I think this is a big existential problem. We have 854 cities in Minnesota. I think in 20 years, we will have less than 400. And that's just a sheer demographic thing. When you go to a city and the median age is over 65, like the boom industry is, transitional senior housing, and like the up and coming boom industry will be the mortuary industry. And then like that's pretty much it, right? Like that's the end. What's going on here? Okay. Let me give you a technical answer, and then let me give you a social answer. When you look at pre-Depression cities, the tyranny of a pre-Depression city, and I'm going to use that word tyranny, I think it's a good word to describe this. The tyranny of a pre-Depression city was that the underlying land values were so high that if you were poor, you were basically marginalized to the outside, the outskirts. Think of a feudal castle. The rich people lived in here, the serfs and the poor people lived out here. Okay? That is the, I hope I haven't nostalgized traditional development too much for you. I don't want you to walk out of here thinking like Chuck Marohn thinks ancient cities were all wonderful. They weren't. They were chamber pots and sewage in the street and tuberculosis and, congestion and just, they were nasty. There was a reason people did this experiment. It wasn't because they were leaving behind something great. Is because these places were really difficult. And one of the big economic tyrannies of it was that cities were designed to build wealth from internal. Remember I said that echo and that incremental development pattern and the whole redevelopment? What prompts that redevelopment is the rising land values. When you build that first increment of a city, the land is really cheap. By the time you get to the second and third increment, the cheap land is out on the edge. And the really expensive land, not the buildings, the land is right in the middle of the town, right by the train stop, right where all the action is. That's the value. And so the more the city would grow incrementally in this pattern, the wealthier those like early people or the people who had the good land in the middle of town, the wealthier they would become. And that became a tyranny for new people coming in. Because if you were coming in, you're gonna have to buy that little place out on the edge. And hopefully after a decade or two or a generation, that little pop-up shack could become a 2-story place and you could rent out the top or have your store on the bottom. And there was mechanisms to build wealth, but a lot of these places struggled to be vibrant because the core was owned by the daddy warbucks, who's the guy in It's a Wonderful Life who owns the whole town. It was that was the tyranny of the age that people were trying to overcome. The automobile overcame that. And how did it overcome it? In a very easy way. Supply and demand. The reason that this land had so much value is because the land in the middle of town had a finite supply. Here's the area that you can easily walk in. All that land is really expensive. Here's the stuff where it's a little bit harder to walk. That land is less expensive, right? Well, now, all of a sudden, the automobile, you can go anywhere. What it did is it took the land values in the middle of the city and it collapsed them. It drove them down. Because what it did is it made lots of land available for living and development, for commercial development, for residential development. And when you have a lot of supply and relatively the same amount of demand, what happens to the price? It craters. So what happened is this land here that was pretty much worthless now has the automobile. It's worth more. This land here that was worth a ton is now worth less, lots less. We broke that tyranny. In a big city, we saw what happened. We saw in a lot of our big cities, the centers emptied out. Those were bad investments. People moved to what were better investments. We saw a gutting of the core. We saw poor people left behind. We experienced that. But those places retained a certain level of wealth, and as I showed you in those photos, they're starting to get pieced back together and knitted back together. Some of them are doing extremely well. Some of them are doing too well. San Francisco, Manhattan, these places have huge unaffordability problems. Washington, D.C. The problem in small towns is that there wasn't enough other stuff there. Once you gutted the town, once you destroyed the value, there wasn't enough other stuff there to keep it all going. You lost like the essence of it, and you can't get it back. I've studied this small town problem a lot because really the only strategy for a small town right now that's not like a patron strategy, and by patron strategy I mean subsidies from the big city will take care of us, because that's really like the economic development strategy for almost every small town today. It's like if we can get subsidies from the state, if we can get subsidies from the federal government, if we can have some type of industry where capital, artificially created here, capital will flow in, like those are the only places that are doing okay. The only way you could like truly bring a small town back is if you adopted what economists call like an import replacement theory, import replacement strategy. Jane Jacobs wrote all about this, the idea that we do everything we can to keep our capital from exiting the community. We get it passed around as much as we can. The problem with that is that is a really hard way to live. It's a really hard way to live in a small town. I grew up in a small town. As an 18-year-old, I cheered when we got Walmart. I cheered. Why did I cheer when we got Walmart? Because shoes cost me like $50, and now I could go get them for $25. If I wanted a computer, I had to drive down to the big city an hour and a half away. Now I could just go up the street and get computer parts. I was a computer geek back then. It was like liberating for me, but it destroyed the whole downtown. It just killed everything. The problem with small towns is that in this experiment, there's no way to make it, to patch it back together. And so I think there has to be a consolidation of them, and I think there will be a natural like burnout of many. And I think that's a tragedy, but I don't really know how to fix it. So I'm sorry. But I mean, do you understand that mechanism with the land values? You can gut a city and there's enough going on in a place like Phoenix where we can, patch it back together. Detroit today, the core downtown is doing fantastic. It's almost unaffordable in places. There's great levels of investment. There's all this stuff going on. They're basically like putting it back together. You could do that in a city the size of Phoenix. You can't do it in a town of 500 or 2,000 or even 5,000. It's really hard. Are we doing okay? I'm having fun. Let me say this. You all have been sitting in chairs for 1 hour and 57 minutes. About an hour and a half is the longest it's reasonable to ask people to sit. How about we do one more question, and then if anybody has anything else they'd like to talk about, I know we have to be out of here at the top of the hour, but I'll hang out up here and you can come up and we can chat one-on-one so everybody who needs to go won't feel impolite by going. If you want to get a hold of me or anything, I've got a bunch of business cards up here. You can come up here and grab one. And if you want to be on like our mailing list or get stuff from us, you can leave your business card here and I will get it entered into our system. So last question. I'm sorry, I did point over here. Go ahead.
You talked about wealth, growing wealth, and sort of what the development of cities, but you said the word twice, which is on and that's affordability. How do you deal with affordability throughout the development of cities, small town, large town?
Right. So the question is, how do we deal with affordability? And how does that contrast with this notion of building wealth? And I'm assuming you're talking about housing affordability, but I think you could also talk about the ability to start up a commercial business and what the upfront costs are with that and that kind of thing. I don't think this is an easy problem to solve in the context we have now because it's so affected by outside forces. I was actually writing this down today because we're doing a big series on housing affordability. And of course, in this country, when you say housing affordability, in some places they hear housing is too expensive. And other places they hear housing is like worth nothing. Like it's a bad investment. If we go to Buffalo, New York, they have a housing affordability problem. It's not the one that you have in San Francisco. It's a very different one. So, you know, both of those like exist in this country. And they're both a byproduct of largely things like beyond our control. I talked about 2001 to 2008 being a housing bubble, 2010 to 2018 being a housing recovery, the same place. What policy actions brought about the bubble? Well, artificially low interest rates, a very lax regulatory environment, a kind of feedback zeal, cultural belief that housing prices would continue to go up, the ability to extract equity and use that to offset low wages and low salaries, the desire, the capacity of people to take on consumer debt, the willingness of our population to live with very little savings. These are all like transitory things that didn't exist a generation ago that exist today. What has increased the housing bubble this time around? Well, I think a lot of those factors are still there. We don't necessarily have the same lax environment, but we do have the Federal Reserve buying every mortgage. You can get mortgages like dirt cheap now today. If you can get it qualified, the bank has zero risk in lending to you because there's a secondary market that will take all of that. We have a lot of systems set up to boost up housing prices. I think it's important in a macro sense to understand one truth about housing prices. It is in everyone who has power, it is in their interest to have housing prices artificially high. Everyone who has power in this country, it's in their interest to have housing prices artificially high. If you're the city, do you want housing prices artificially high or artificially low? You want them high because you're going to get more tax revenue, you're going to have more money coming in, you're going to have a bigger tax base. If you are a bank, do you want them artificially low or artificially high? You want them artificially high because you're not going to have defaults, you're not going to get jingle mail, you're going to have a good liquid market. If you are a current homeowner, would you rather have your home be way overvalued or way undervalued? You'd rather have it worth way, way more than what it actually is. So what we have is we have a system that has a lot of moving parts to it, where basically like every gut instinct of everyone who has a say at every junction of the system is to make prices higher, not lower. So if you want things to be affordable, understand you're fighting the man, and the man in like the universal big sense of the word, like you're fighting the whole system. I think the question that I can answer tonight is how do we not make wealth creation equal displacement because things become unaffordable? And I think that is a question we can struggle with at the local level and we can do something about. And to me, the answer to that is the increment of intensity that you grow with. We're doing some work in Akron right now, Akron, Ohio. And there are neighborhoods in Akron, Ohio where the median house price is $40,000. That's a poor neighborhood, okay? The city looks at success in that neighborhood as going in, getting a $40,000 home torn down and getting a $150,000 home built. They're saying like that's success. We've got a housing authority, they're going in, they're making things happen. That's terrible. Success in a neighborhood of $40,000 homes is the next year having the median value in that neighborhood be $42,000. That's a 5% increase in value. If your stock portfolio went up 5% this year, would you be happy? Yes, you would be. We can do that year after year after year by resisting the temptation to make huge transformative leaps in our development pattern and essentially restraining and disciplining ourselves to make modest investments over a broad area, over a long period of time, the incremental development pattern. If we can grow incrementally in a way where we're increasing property values by 5%, 6%, 7% a year, we're building wealth in neighborhoods where the people who are there are the ones who are going to experience the wealth formation. And that's the key to not having displacement. The other key, and I think this goes along with it and it's really critical, is that we have to allow every single neighborhood to breathe and evolve. You should be allowed by right to build the next level of intensity everywhere at all times. So if you have a neighborhood of single-family homes, you should by right be able to convert your home into a duplex, or do an addition, or tear it down and build a duplex, or whatever. That should be allowed by right. You should be able to have a mother-in-law apartment or what have you. Because those are the way that people come in and they can either stay in a neighborhood or make an investment and make something work better. They can rent out a room in the basement for an extra $250 a month to, someone who's not their family member, and make the mortgage payment on an equity loan to fix something up. Those are the things that make neighborhoods flexible and robust and actually grow without kicking people out. Where we kick people out is when we go to the neighborhood and we say, single family home, now you can go to a 4-story condo unit or 6-story apartment building. Because what we do is we change the underlying dynamics of that neighborhood. We wind up stagnating it because everybody there is waiting for like the big sell. We artificially raise the property values and we stagnate the neighborhood. If we can discipline ourselves to have incremental development everywhere, but no more than that, we could grow robustly over a broad area without making it unaffordable for people, de facto. Thank you so much for being here. And